Hey everyone, if you're enjoying my RM audiobooks, don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that hype, and maybe check out my Patreon if you want to support the channel even more. Your support means a lot and helps me keep these coming. Now, sit back and enjoy the story.
Noble. Chapter 1. Summary. Things didn't go exactly as Voldemort had planned in the graveyard. Instead of a whimpering teenager, he was met with a powerful man, one that truly instilled fear in the Dark Lord. Where Harry is a reincarnation of the Noblesse, Cadis Etrama di Raizel, also known as Rye. June 24, 1994, day of the third task, Little Hangleton Graveyard. Tom Marvolo Riddle, also known as Voldemort, he who must not be named, you know who, and undoubtedly many other crasser forms of address he couldn't care to list, was as of now, very confused. Which was alarming, to say the least, because the last time he had been confused, he'd been nearly killed by an infant. Said infant, now teenager, was still the cause of his confusion. There were two causes for his confusion. The first being that he, Voldemort, was resurrected to what he'd been before he underwent several transformations courtesy his fascination with admittedly unnecessary dark rituals. By his calculation, he should have gone back to being a somewhat humanoid-looking snake. But here he was, looking like he was a 20-something version of himself. For the first time in a long time he felt whole, like he'd been missing some unnameable thing. Voldemort furrowed his newly reintroduced brows. He hadn't felt like this since. His eyes widened in realization as it dawned upon him. He hadn't felt like this since his 6th year at Hogwarts, when he made his first Horcrux. That meant his soul was whole again. He narrowed his, and flared his magic outward, causing the whimpering rat of a follower he had to flinch. He turned to face his prisoner, one Hadrian, Harry, James Potter. There was his second cause of confusion. The boy looked wholly unperturbed by the turn of events. In fact, he looked almost comfortable in his position tied to a statue. There was also the fact that he was bleeding, or rather, black ooze was coming from the scar that the Dark Lord had given him when he suffered that embarrassing defeat. Not to mention the other injuries that the boy had suffered. Yet he was looking bored. The Dark Lord studied his rival, or equal, as the prophecy would have it. The boy had always been a mystery to him, when he and the boy's first year took home in the back of Quirrell's head. Firstly, the hat had placed him in Ravenclaw, to the surprise of absolutely everyone but the boy. He then proved his sorting by placing first in every course he took. Even Severus had grudgingly praised the boy's accomplishments when it came to potions. But it became even more clear as to why the hat had placed him in Ravenclaw. The boy was totally socially inept. In fact, the only time he spoke was when he was asked questions in class, to which he responded to with prompt answers, thankfully not direct quotations from a book, like that annoying know-it-all Granger girl would. Despite that, he managed to only increase his fan following. The Dark Lord supposed it was due to how he looked. According to the Hogwarts female population, the boy was good-looking. He'd unfortunately overheard several inappropriate conversations about his looks while passing by cliques of girls. He'd almost pitied the boy. Almost. He could understand where the appeal came from, although he was reluctant to admit. The boy had aristocratic features, all sharp angles, and a straight nose. He had, by some quirk of fate, evaded the curse of the Potter hair. Instead, he had straight hair to his shoulders, which curled ever so slightly at the ends. It also always fell into those eyes of his, which were emerald green in color. Curiously, the boy wore a single earring, which had a cross dangling from it. Some mudbloods had assumed that he was a Christian because of it, or more creatively, a second coming of Jesus, ignorant as they were. Voldemort could always sense a strong magic from the cross, though. The boy had always held himself with an air of aristocracy and nobility. He did everything with a silent, effortless grace the upper crust of society trained for years to have. The theory that he was a Vila had become very popular and amused Voldemort to no end. But the boy was, as stated before, completely and utterly socially inept, and therefore had only tilted his head in silent confusion when asked the question if he was a Vila, before promptly answering that Vila could only bear girls, and that he could provide some books on the subject if they were that interested. McGonagall had looked extremely amused while retelling her favorite student's consternation. Therefore, he'd been extremely surprised to find Potter waiting for him, or rather, Quirrell when he'd finally managed to get through the were they even considered obstacles? He'd greeted them rather calmly. Individually. Quirrell had of course stared at him for a good 10 minutes, before the boy that reminded him of the stone, to which Quirrell had responded rather stupidly with a blink. Finally, Voldemort, who was equally as surprised at having been discovered, ordered the idiot to let him speak to the boy. Before he could have initiated conversation, however, the boy gave him a critical once-over, before nodding to himself, and then greeted Voldemort with his given name of Tom. Voldemort had of course lost it, and had attacked him with his fists, of all of things, like a muggle, and had promptly disintegrated to dust. Now that he thought about it, it was the single, most stupid thing he'd done. Voldemort was brought out of his musings by something wet touching the hem of his robes. "What is it, Wormtail?" he snapped irritably. He didn't have time for the rat. Potter was giving him a headache by existing, and he'd rather not deal with the bumbling band of baboons that were his Death Eaters on top of that. All of them were either insane, dead, or had deserted either way. Master, please?" the blubbering fool finally uttered on his 7th attempt, before holding out his stub where his hand had been. Voldemort sighed internally, before stunning the nitwit and returning his attention to Potter. He blinked. The boy had freed himself from the bindings, and had conjured 2 cushy chairs and a table that looked extremely place in the graveyard. Potter gestured to the empty chair beside him and raised an eyebrow in question. Voldemort stared, and stared, and stared some more. Finally giving up on making sense of this ridiculous situation and Potter in general, he pinched the bridge of nose and almost fell into the offered chair. "Tea?" Potter asked, still completely unperturbed. Voldemort almost snapped at him to explain what the hell he was thinking and that they were enemies, not bosom buddies, before his stomach gave a rather loud growl. Silence like no other descended upon the graveyard. "Dinner," then Potter said, still looking goddamned unperturbed. Voldemort meanwhile debated what he could have done to deserve such treatment, both from Potter and from fate. Dobby, the strangest house elf Voldemort had ever seen, popped into existence, wearing at least 12 pairs of mismatched socks and 20 pairs of woolen hats. "Master Hadrian Potter called? What could Dobby do for the noble master?" the elf said with a bow, the hats miraculously not falling off his head in the process. "A full dinner for the 2 of us, and tea afterwards." "Anything you would like?" Potter said, and raised an eyebrow in his direction. Again, Voldemort, having been surprised enough for at least a lifetime in the span of half an hour, decided to just go with the flow. "A cup of hot chocolate for me, with cream, and crumpets, and chocolate cake," the darkest lord in wizarding history said in a monotone voice. Potter didn't even bat an eyelash. Instead he turned to the elf. "Oh, and don't forget, Dobby, you're not to tell anyone." "All right." The elf nodded eagerly and disappeared with a pop, and almost immediately returned with everything that he was ordered to. Dinner, it turns out, consisted of every dish available in Hogwarts. Though he did see that Potter only poured himself a bowl of ramen, much to the disappointment of the elf Dobby, it seemed. Voldemort had of course noticed the boy's dependency on ramen, as had the rest of the school in the boy's first year. It seemed that it hadn't changed. After they were well fed, Potter initiated the conversation on the topic of what the hell he was doing having a congenial dinner with the murderer of his parents. "I understand that you are somewhat surprised by today's turn of events," he started, but was interrupted by Voldemort snorting in derisiveness. "Understatement of the century, Potter. Why are you so calm about my return? For that matter, why are you always so calm? Why are you talking to me right now instead of throwing curses at me? And why the hell is my soul whole again? Why is there some sort of black ooze still dripping from you, Scar? Why are you still awake after losing at least a gallon of blood from your wounds? And why the hell does that bother me in the first place?" The Dark Lord had worked himself up and was letting his frustration be known. Potter only took a sip of his tea before answering. "Well, let's start with the easiest. My blood is special. It wouldn't have worked with a split soul, so the magic in my blood caused your soul to come together. My scar was holding a soul piece of yours. So when your soul assembled, it left my scar. The black ooze is the result of the dark magic finally flushing out of my system. As for my calmness, that's just my personality. When you have lived as long as I have, most things don't really scare you, or do anything to you, really. As for why I haven't passed out, my kind is much more resilient than humans. And as for your concern, a bond occurred when you took my blood. In the olden days, this bond allowed my kind to control humans. I forbade it, of course, when it became clear that our species couldn't intermingle without disastrous results." Voldemort stared slack-jawed at the teenager. That gave him as many questions as answers. "What do you mean, lived as long as you have? You're 14. And what about your kind? And control humans? How?" Voldemort was more incredulous than frustrated now. Potter poured himself another cup of tea and added as much sugar as there was liquid before answering. "To put it simply, I am a reincarnation. My former body didn't live in this dimension, but another. Therefore, you won't find any history of my kind as long you're here. But I will tell you, millions of years before humans were even a thought, my kind came to be. We were powerful and virtually immortal. We called ourselves nobles. Our form of government included one lord, to lead the clans of noble and the noblesse, the judge, jury, and executioner, and ultimately the guardian of my people." Potter took a sip of his tea. "I am, or rather was, the noblesse. My former body died in battle, you see, with my resurrected twin brother, but let's not talk about that. I was reborn here, in this universe, because wizards are destroying magic. As the guardian, I was tasked to come to this world to save it. Now, enough about that. As for your question about controlling humans, if a human willingly takes a noble's blood, he is immediately bound to him as a servant. Thus, your talents, all of them are mine to use. In return, you receive a form immortality. You'll probably live as a 20-something-year-old for the rest of eternity, as long as you don't die in battle, or try to kill the contractor, which in this case is me. Voldemort looked rather faint at hearing the news. He was bound to serve for all eternity. To Potter, no less. He stared into Potter's eyes, looking for a hint of a lie. But he knew it was useless. Potter couldn't lie, socially inept that he was. So, what do I address you as, then? Voldemort looked like he was trying very hard not to have aneurysm while uttering these words. The noblesse hummed into his teacup. My former servant always called me master. But I find that it will strange coming from you, instead of Frankenstein. A look of longing crossed the Guardian's face, gone before Voldemort could identify it. Potter turned his head towards Voldemort with a slight smile. Voldemort blinked. He had no doubt he was the first person that the noblesse smiled to. He couldn't help but feel a little honored. My name is Cadis Etrama di Raizel. My human companions called me Raizel. Voldemort stared at the noblesse, knowing that he was the first person in this reality to know the man's name. He bowed. Lord Rai, please address me as Marvolo. Raizel's smile widened slightly. Chapter 2. Unknown location, unknown time. Cadis Etrama di Raizel curiously inspected his surroundings. Just moments ago he'd been battling his brother, who was, or rather had been bent on something along the lines of taking over the planet and the enslavement of humans. Raizel wasn't really sure, as he'd never really paid any mind to any of his enemies' ramblings, much like he didn't listen to Frankenstein's lectures about his own grandeur. It always had seemed like a waste of time. Anyways, he frowned at the thought that he now equated his twin brother with an enemy. He supposed millenniums of estrangement did that to a person, whether they be a noble or not. His brother returned to the living had forced Raizel to take some rather extreme measures, resulting in his own and brother's demise. He supposed he had entered a version of eternal sleep, while he was sure that his brother's soul was completely destroyed. That was the price of coming back to the dimensions of life when you had been banished once. Your soul paid the price, by completely disappearing once you were once again died. Raizel supposed it wasn't his brother's fault. It wasn't like he'd purposely told Roctus' daughter, Ignis, to bring him back to life. But it was his own brother's fault for following Ignis. Raizel frowned at the thought of the woman. In his long life, he'd never really hated anybody but that stupid woman. Oh, Frankenstein may think him incapable of holding such emotions, but Raizel wasn't that perfect. Ignis had destroyed the noble unity their kind had enjoyed for eons. Just for her own greed. She'd ensnared so many of his friends, and he'd been forced to execute them. But that was all in the past. Now he was dead. A ghost of a smirk ghosted over his face. Unlike his brother, he couldn't truly die. A perk of being the guardian of Earth, he supposed. Unlike popular belief, he had more than just nobles under his protection. In fact, he was created to protect most things from the nobles. Such an overpowered race had needed someone to watch over them. So the noblesse had been created, born to the first lord of the nobles. He'd of course taken the mantle of the noblesse fairly quickly, as his father had understood that he was supposed to do so, and had done so for millions of years. Up until now. Now he was in what he recognized as the council's hall. The white-colored opulent hall was vast, with no end in sight, except for 4 humongous thrones occupying it. The thrones were different in design and color, as the council itself consisted of the 3 different entities: life, death, and fate. As such, life's throne was glittering with a combination of green and earthy colors, while death's throne was completely void of any color. Raizel could never decide if it was white or black. Fate's throne, however, was ever-changing in color. The last throne was colored a deep red with golden and black undertones. It was Raizel's throne. Raizel himself had been one of those entities, being born as a guardian. Fate was the eldest of them. It had existed before life and death. Because fate somehow came to be, life and death came to as well. Because then it was fated. Raizel's had puzzled both life and death, as he'd suddenly come out of nowhere, eons after them. Like all entities before him, Raizel had been born with an innate knowledge of his task, which was to guard the established order. Therefore, he'd only introduced himself briefly to his seniors before taking on the mantle of noblesse. Raizel shook his head. He could muse about the past later. First, he had to call his, for lack of a better word, seniors. Raizel concentrated and shook off his mortal disguise, reaching a height of at least 100 feet in mortal terms. He then seated himself in his throne. He sighed as his powers greeted him, and suddenly the buzz of hundreds voices calling for help became stronger. He suppressed them quickly, lest he get a headache. Him sitting in his throne after millenniums alerted the others of his wish to speak to them. He doubted they didn't know of his return. In fact, he was sure that they every single detail of his life on Earth, nosy as they were. With a flash, the other entities controlling the universes appeared in their thrones. Much like its throne, the entity called Fate was ever-changing. Unlike Raizel, Life, and Death, who had each chosen a gender, Fate simply couldn't, because its nature was to be ever-changing. Fate was a dichotomy in that way, Raizel thought. Life had chosen the form of a female human, though when dinosaurs had roamed the Earth, she'd been determined for her form to be the most terrifying of them. Raizel thought it was rather fitting she chose the form of a woman. Honestly, Raizel had never understood women, whether they be noble or human. Their thought process was way too convoluted for him to follow. And he would know, being who he was. Death had chosen a human form, though its gender was indistinguishable, much like his throne's color. Raizel had of course chosen the form of a humanoid male, more out of habit than anything else. Raizel appraised his seniors for a moment before he sighed. I know that you were involved in my rather early return. Though I have no doubt that my protégés will be able to handle the situation, it was not part of the plan. Fate, who had thankfully deigned to take a humanoid form, shrugged nonchalantly. It was necessary. The wizards and witches of the Magicaverse are on the verge of wiping each other out. Magic itself is rather weak right now as well. I had plans of sending you there as a savior of sort. There is a prophecy in everything, it said. Raizel blinked. The Magicaverse was one of the most important dimensions. The reason for its importance was magic. Magic was a force that had been instrumental in the universe's existence. If the universe that strengthened the foundation of the universes collapsed, reality itself would probably cease. You will be born as a wizard, with your powers intact of course. This time, that ridiculous course of it affecting your body won't be a problem. I'm much more experienced in making a sturdy human. Life interrupted Raizel's musings. That was actually a relief. If that curse hadn't hindered him, he'd be done with Ignis Cravii and the Union in a matter of seconds. Instead, it had taken him almost a millennium, most of which he had slept. But still, our goal is to unify the wizards and witches, which is easier said than done, of course. They've gotten their prejudices against each other so deep-rooted that it's impossible to convince them that killing the other party isn't the solution. Death said in a frustrated tone. Raizel blinked in surprise. It must be really bad at Death was complaining about, well, Death. They've got this strange idea that magic is divided, as in light or dark, which they equate with good and bad respectively, ignorant little fools that they are. It's tearing magic itself apart. Death concluded rather impassioned. Fate turned its temporary head towards Raizel, who had finally understood why an entity was needed to solve a mortal matter. Lord Fate, if you could give some further details on this matter, so I am sufficiently prepared. Raizel requested of the elder. Fate tilted its head at being addressed as Lord, but smiled in appreciation at Raizel's politeness. For Raizel, it was rather normal, as being polite was step one of being a noble. And he figured Lord was an appropriate term, as both female and male noble leaders were addressed as Lord. Well, it begins with one Albus Dumbledore and Tom Marvolo Riddle. Chapter 3. July 31st, 1980. Being born, Raizel decided, was unpleasant. As was being a newborn, for that matter. Not being able to communicate, suddenly bursting into tears because his body demanded food, not to mention the feeding itself. Raizel shuddered just thinking about, causing his mother to shift. Raizel smiled at the thought of his mother. Like all children, he'd formed a deep bond with his mother even before he was born. It was only natural, after all. Seeing him smile, his mother, whose name he knew to be Lily Potter, cooed. The smile slipped from Raizel's face as he frowned. He would not be cooed at. He was the noblesse, for goodness sake. His mother too frowned at his sudden change of expression and sent a panicked look towards someone. Raizel turned his head to see that it was a man wearing glasses with a bird nest for hair. His father, he supposed. If the equally panicked look he sent another male in the room was something to go by. Padfoot, something's wrong, he was just smiling and look at him frown, oh God, did we mess something up, maybe the nurse dash. As his father went on about his worries, the man now identified as Padfoot just laughed. Relax, James. The little guy's barely been born. He's probably overwhelmed by the amount of love you guys are showing him. Of course, as his godfather, I fully approve. The man puffed out his chest as he calmed a frantic James. His father snorted and turned around to face someone else. Does that make any kind of sense, Mooney? James said a bit sardonically. The man called Mooney just sighed. Just then, the door opened to reveal a rat-like man nervously making his way in. Is that him? Is that? The newcomer said in a tone that Raizel definitely didn't like. Evidently neither did his mother, as she spoke for the first time. Yes, Peter. Please, everyone. Say hi to Hadrian James Potter. Lily Potter said rather forcefully. Potter Black. Padfoot said lazily. Everyone in the room turned their attention towards him with wide questioning eyes. Sirius Black snorted. "He's my heir. And nothing you say will change my mind," he announced. James spluttered. "But what if you have your own children?" Sirius just waved his hand dismissively. "I'll deal with it then. But as it stands, Harry's mine as much as he's yours." James blinked. "Wait, Harry?" Now it was Sirius' turn to blink. "Yeah, it suits him, don't you think?" He shrugged. "No, it does not," thought Raizel sullenly, and glared at Sirius. Sirius was clearly startled by his glaring. "I think that he doesn't like it. What about Hadrian?" Everyone's head whipped towards Lily. Raizel smiled at his preferred nickname from his Noblesse days. Lily nodded. "Rai it is, then." James blinked at the conversation that had just taken place between his wife and newborn baby. A huge grin broke on his face. "My son's a genius, Padfoot. Did you see him respond to Lily like he could understand her? I bet he'll be smartest little bloke on the planet." "That's my Rai," he said excitedly, while Sirius just nodded numbly, still clearly shocked at being stared down by a newborn infant. And that's how Raizel was introduced to his parents and the Marauders and learned to love them. Though he never did like Peter. October 31st, 1981. Raizel stared at the man who had just killed his parents from his crib. He wasn't sure why Lily Potter had thought that sprinting for the second floor would be a good idea in the first place. Maybe it had something to do with the pentagram she'd drawn in her blood below his crib. Said pentagram had glowed briefly as Lily had made her sacrifice. Raizel cursed his inability to communicate properly with his mother. If he could, then she would have known that he didn't need a sacrifice to survive whatever curse their attacker would throw at him. But such was the plan of fate. No matter how fond of his parents he'd become, he couldn't risk the plan. His attacker was a humanoid snake, very different from what Tom Marvolo Riddle may have looked like had he not split his soul. And he was clearly, undoubtedly, insane. Voldemort lifted his wand and threw the killing curse at Raizel, who barely blinked. After all, it was part of fate's plan. As it hit him on the forehead, Raizel let out a startled cry. Fate hadn't warned him that it would hurt. The curse rebounded at the caster, who was clearly confused at this surprising turn, excuse the pun, of events. It hit Voldemort squarely in the chest. The would-be Dark Lord let loose a terrifying scream that frankly grated on Raizel's ears. Honestly, couldn't he just drop barely dead quietly? Humans and their dramatics. The result of Voldemort being hit by his own curse, the Dark Lord was ripped from his barely human-looking body. A sliver of his already shredded soul escaped from him and latched onto Raizel, who tried to bat it away, but eventually sighed in defeat and allowed for it to settle in the scar Voldemort had just given him. Thankfully, the wraith itself had enough common sense to see that possessing a toddler would not do him any good. It left the ruined house, letting loose another unnecessary scream of rage. Raizel sighed as he looked sadly at his mother's limp form. He had loved her and his father. But no one could stop death when it collected its dues. Tired from the events of the evening, Raizel laid down in his crib and slept, and missed his placement with the Dursleys. Rather rude of his estranged aunt to scream at the sight of him and wake him up. September 1st, Hogwarts. Hadrian Potter. Did she say Hadrian Potter? As in Harry Potter? The boy who lived? He's really here? Oh my Merlin, he is so handsome. And are seeing the way he walks? Yeah, it's like he's floating. Did you see his earring? Huh? He's wearing an earring? Yeah. Raizel walked calmly to the rickety-looking stool where the cat lady was holding a rather unhygienic-looking hat for his to try on. He squashed his annoyance at being called that infernal nickname. Being whispered about he could tolerate, as he'd been whispered about since, well, forever, but Harry was a ruffian name with no elegance, and he couldn't stand a moment of being called that. He could see a sea of students stretching their necks to get a good look on him, before the hat that was now upon his head blocked his view. Raizel wrinkled his nose delicately. He would need to wash his hair tonight. Oh my. A voice said in his head. He recognized it to be the hat, as it had sung a song before. I thought I would have the pleasure of sitting on the guardian's head. An honor it is, my lord. I apologize for contaminating your head, but I believe it is rather necessary. Now, where should I put a virtual deity? Raizel didn't bother replying. He already knew its decision. After all, he was much more intelligent than any human could ever be, though his former servant came close. Even though he was socially unaware, he supposed. But humans were so confusing, and children even more so. He'd rather not deal with them more than he needed to. Of course. You, my lord, will fit perfectly in Ravenclaw. The hat shouted the last part out loud, much to the shock of everyone else in the hall. Silence enveloped the hall. Raizel just walked to the Ravenclaw table and sat down, his expression completely blank. A rather thin boy looked at him in wonder before he whispered, "We got Potter," in a disbelieving tone. As if a divine revelation had come to him, the boys suddenly shouted. "We got Potter! Take that, Gryffindor!" That seemed to break whatever trance the table had gotten themselves caught in, and broke into raucous cheers and mad applause. Raizel blinked, before subtly tilting his head in silent confusion. He truly could never understand humans. The sorting was soon done, and the headmaster, one of the people he needed to deal with somehow, stood and delivered some words that Raizel was sure meant to confuse everyone. After that, they were treated to a sudden feast, as food suddenly appeared on the table. Another Hadrian Potter may have jumped in joy at being offered so much food, but Raizel just stared at the table. He'd of course not grown up neglected and abused at the hands of his uncle and aunt. He was a deity after all, and ordering those disgusting mortals who were beneath Raizel's notice to treat him as he wished to be treated was laughably easy. Weak-minded as they were, his childhood had been easy. No, the reason for his staring wasn't his surprise at seeing so many types of food. Suli, who'd been blushing nonstop for being the one sitting beside him, gathered up her courage to ask, Mr. Potter Hadrian, sir, I mean, why are you staring at the food like that?" Raizel broke his glum his staring of the food and looked at Suli with a look that broke her heart. The rest of the table had gone silent, concerned at why their savior wasn't digging in. "There's no ramen." "Oh, well, I'm sure you can ask Professor Dumbledore to tell the elves to make it for you." Suli was rather embarrassed by the whole ordeal. Raizel immediately perked up and walked to the headmaster's seat. Albus Dumbledore blinked in surprise as he lifted his head to meet Avada Kedavra green gem-like eyes. "Harry, my dear, what can I do for you?" The aged headmaster put on a grandfatherly smile as he attempted to hide his confusion. Raizel suddenly glared at him and flared his aura, making him, the venerated headmaster of Hogwarts, feel intimidated. The whole hall was following whatever that was happening at the staff table with bated breaths, having felt the flicker of power from Raizel. "Please, do not call me Harry. Hadrian, or Mr. Potter will do. As for what you can do for me, well, I would like some ramen." Albus blinked before he nodded slowly. "Of course, dear boy." Nifty. A house elf appeared and bowed low. "If you could bring Mr. Potter here some ramen, it would be nice." Nifty nodded, a bit wide-eyed at the request, and popped away. Raizel gave a satisfied nod to Dumbledore and walked back to his seat. A while later, a bowl of ramen appeared in front of him. Raizel smiled and began to eat. He loved ramen. The rest of the school finally snapped out of their trance and went slowly back to eating, gossiping about what had just happened. Little did Raizel know that this moment would be the cause of the ramen obsession the British magical community, especially the females, would adopt. He approved of it 100% of course, once he found out. Chapter 4. September 1st, 1992. Raizel sighed in relief as he finally found an empty compartment. He hurriedly sat down, locking the door with a spell. His trunk was in his pocket, safely shrunk. The Noblesse hadn't foregone the usual school-grade trunk, but had added plenty of modifications to it. Now, it had an elegant design, swirling all over the trunk surface. He'd of course added a password, and it was in the noble language, making it extra safe, as no one in this dimension knew the language. He'd added several other modifications. His clothing compartment was now a wardrobe, and he'd added a library and a potion storage. He could of course make many other modifications, like adding an apartment or a mansion, or even a small country in his trunk, but felt that it would be an overkill. He was supposed to be 12 after all, and he was supposed to uphold some air of normality, and no matter how prodigious, preteens weren't supposed to keep small countries in their trunks. He was shaken out of his thoughts as he heard someone banging on his compartment door. Come to think of it, was the train wobbling? He found his answer when finally looked up to see who was causing such ruckus. The Guardian of Earth's eyes widened, fear evident in them. In the past year, he'd been introduced to the most terrifying creatures he had the displeasure of meeting. Fangirls. He had of course had some experience with them during his stint as a high school student in his previous dimension, but these were different kinds of beasts. They were magical for one thing, and he was the boy who lived, which apparently gave them the right to stalk and use his body like a dress-up doll and demand he demonstrate unheard feats of. He was their savior and their dancing monkey. He'd heard that some were even writing fanfictions. Whatever that was, he had a feeling that he didn't really want to know. No wonder Magic was dying. It was disappointed that these persons existed. The door creaked dangerously. Raizel sighed. Time to make his escape. He pulled out a small rectangular-shaped piece of wood which curiously curled up on the edges. It was made of ebony, with red ruby to make graceful details. He tapped it with his wand, enlarging the piece so it big enough to stand on. The girls outside stopped banging and screaming hysterically, their curiosity getting the better of them. Raizel allowed himself a small smile. When he'd first seen brooms, he'd been disgusted at the prospect of flying with a stick between his legs. As the Guardian, He could fly without any kind of aid, but as he was currently 12, it wouldn't be a good idea to reveal that particular talent, he suspected. So he created this. It was essentially a broom, he grudgingly admitted. But unlike those disgraceful contraptions, you just had to stand on it instead of putting it between your legs. He had yet to name it, though. He grabbed his flying board and opened the window. Pausing, he turned to the stunned-looking girls, allowing himself an unnoticeable smirk. Then he jumped out the window of the Hogwarts Express. The fangirls let loose shrieks of fright, rushing to the windows. They saw nothing. Many burst into tears. They'd gotten their idol to commit suicide. At the head of the train, a happy guardian rode his flying wooden board, free of the dreaded horde of girls, completely oblivious to the pandemonium he'd caused. Rai landed in front of the gates. He tucked his board under his arm, sending it a fond look towards it. He'd taken the liberty of flying a bit outside of just following the Hogwarts Express and gotten too into it, and thus he was late. Oh well, it wasn't like he'd missed anything important. The singing hat was a bit weird if you asked him. As he entered the Great Hall, he noticed that many girls were crying. Even some of the professors were shedding tears. Dumbledore, who was the only one who'd spotted Rai, was looking a bit bemused though. The first years just looked confused. Shrugging, he made his way towards the Ravenclaw table, where he spotted Suli, who was staring at her food with an expression Rai had trouble reading. During last year, he had struck somewhat of companionship with her. She was one of the few people who didn't behave like a complete idiot around him, though she often shook her head at him and stared at him like he was insane. Though that had been less at the end of their school year. He sat down next to her. "Hello, Sue. What is happening?" There was no reaction. He poked her in the arm. Still no reaction. He sighed and flicked her forehead. "Ow," she yelled, drawing the attention of the table to her. "Why did you do it, Rai?" she exclaimed. Rai frowned. She was behaving weirdly. "You were not paying attention. Now, would you like to tell me what was happening? And why is everybody staring? And where is my ramen?" he replied, still reeling at the lack of ramen at the table. Pin drop silence. Suli just stared at him like he was insane. Dumbledore cleared his throat, standing up. "Now that we have confirmed that Mr. Potter is indeed alive, I would like to remind the house elves to cook ramen. Now, moving on. Welcome. We would like to remind everybody to not enter the Forbidden Forest. Mr. Filch has the entire Hogwarts rulebook for those who'd like to know them. Now, let me introduce our new professor in data, Mr. Gilderoy Lockhart." As Dumbledore finished his speech, a smarmy-looking man stood and waved, flashing a blinding smile. As he heard the new professor's thoughts, Rai decided that Hogwarts had reached a new low. At least Quirrell had been somewhat competent. Even if he had Voldemort sticking out of head. He ate his ramen, bid Sue goodnight, and set towards the Ravenclaw common room. The only thing Rai was looking forward to was going to the library. It was the only place where there was peace, beside his heavily warded dorm room. Thank goodness Ravenclaws had separate rooms. Classes were going to be boring. Transfiguration easy, as was Charms. Both Professor McGonagall and Professor Flitwick were extremely impressed and, for some reason, never forgot to remind him that his parents had excelled in their respective fields. Dada had been a bore, even though Quirrell did deliver useful information through his fake stammer. Being who he was, Rai had known the moment Quirrell had been possessed, and therefore had confronted him when he went for the stone. Now that he thought about it, greeting an insane Dark Lord with a name he hated wasn't his brightest idea, but oh well. History of magic was a disgrace. Binns was a disgrace to all ghosts and teachers and ghostly teachers everywhere, which was why Rai hadn't bothered to turn up after the first lesson. Astronomy was barely better. The subject as a whole was a waste of time, only useful to those with a talent in divination and centaurs. Last time he checked, there were no centaurs in the class. Potions, though, were annoying. Every lesson, he procured a perfect potion, but the teacher had yet to acknowledge him as more than a spoiled brat. He'd read his thoughts, of course. He knew why Severus Snape hated Hadrian Potter's existence. But he wasn't just Hadrian Potter. He was the Guardian. And he didn't like to be thought of as a fool. Granted, in his previous life, he pretended to not understand certain things so he could watch Frankenstein run around in circles and procure manuals for him to understand the thing. Raizel smiled to himself. That never got old. But point was, he disliked Severus Snape. So potions was a subject that annoyed him because he had to endure the company of a man with the maturity of a 5-year-old. He dearly hoped he didn't have potions on Mondays. Albus Dumbledore was peering at his new favorite student as said student sipped tea, somehow making the simple action look extremely elegant. Albus Dumbledore was also very confused. He didn't like being confused. "So, you did indeed jump out of the window of the Hogwarts Express, which was driving at the time?" Rai just nodded absently as he poured himself another cup of tea with a dangerous amount of sugar, enough to make him, a famed lover of everything sweet, grimace slightly. "May I ask how you, managed to, Escape certain death? Albus intoned slowly, not sure how to process this. I flew, was his curt reply. Albus waited for an explanation. And waited. And waited. Ah, he said at last. He dismissed his student, even though it felt like it was he who was being dismissed. For the first time in 50 years, Albus Dumbledore drank himself to a stupor. He was too old for this. Chapter 5. Section 2nd Year Data. Raizel stared at his quiz. And stared some more. He did, in fact, spend the time allotted for the given quiz staring at it. He was oblivious to the stares that were following him from the Ravenclaw part of the class. Most of his fellow Ravens had decided to reserve judgment on Lockhart, though the majority were leaning towards, I don't want to be insulted by being teached by this narcissistic buffoon, and why the hell did Dumbledore hire him? They shared the class with Hufflepuff, and it seemed like the majority of the Puffs were thinking that the sun shone out of Lockhart's arse. Thus the Ravens had decided to do whatever Rye did. He was the top student in their year after all. Lockhart had finally found the right end of his wand, somehow, and was now summoning in the papers. The Claws noticed that Raizel didn't even react when his paper was summoned, and just continued staring where it had been. Now, let's see. Miss Abbott seems to be the only one who has a perfect score. Though, I must say, I am a little disappointed with the level on non-performance the Ravenclaws have shown. I would have expected much more from my old house, the blonde buffoon said in a slightly disapproving tone. Many Claws recoiled in disgust at sharing such a thing in common with the egotistical fame whore. Raizel, however, still showed no reaction. Even the Puffs were beginning to notice him not moving. Was he even breathing? Lockhart decided then that it was now a good time to dig his own grave. Oh, and my dear Harry, you haven't even written your name. I had high expectations from someone of your caliber. Weren't you the top student last year? Perhaps the teacher favored you. You never know with these people trying to cozy up to people with fame like me and you dash. You may refer to me as Mr. Potter or Heir Lord Potter if you must. And I doubt that Quirrell favored me, what with Voldemort residing in the back of head. I will not give you the honor of being called professor by me, as you clearly don't deserve it. I am going to study privately for this subject from here on. You may not stop me, and I doubt that Professor Flitwick is going to force me to attend this mockery of a class when I show him what you call a quiz. Goodbye. With that, the boy who lived stood up and left. Awkward silence descended on the classroom. Lockhart gaped like a fish. The Ravenclaw students exchanged glances. One by one they left. Some Puffs followed. Soon only a few Puffs were left in the room, looking extremely distraught. Lockhart forced a fake smile on his face. So, who would like meat freshly caught Cornish pixies? Nobody turned up to the next lesson. Sue. Yes, Rye? Have you noticed the youngest Weasley constantly writing in a small black book? No. Why are we talking about this? I feel a dark energy coming from it. And doesn't she look weaker by the day? Now that you mention it. Yes, I know I am right. So, could you get that book for me? Why? Shouldn't we report it to I don't know, a professor? We need to be sure first. I guess you're right. You know I am. Why do I do this to myself? Did I hear a yes? Yes. Great. You're going to be the death of me. Probably not. 2 days later, Sue presented Rye with an innocent-looking black book. If someone noticed that Ginny Weasley suddenly got more healthy-looking after that, they didn't mention it. And Sue suddenly couldn't remember something. But she blamed it on Rye anyway. Rye decided he was offended. Lockhart suddenly left at the end of the year. To Azkaban. Apparently an adult had finally found out that he was a fraud. By that point, only Hermione Granger was attending any of his lessons. When she was finally forced to acknowledge that Lockhart was a fraud, the poor girl had looked like someone had just destroyed her worldview. But BB books don't lie. No, Miss Granger. Books can lie. Because humans write them. And humans lie. Now put yourself together, girl. You're embarrassing yourself. A slightly irritated-looking Minerva McGonagall told the bookworm. The Transfiguration professor had been extremely embarrassed to know that her smartest lion had been the only one in the whole school to continue with Lockhart's class. Of course, she supposed the girl had developed an unhealthy obsession with authority figures and books, as they likely had been her only companions, but still. She hadn't been able to look any of the other heads in the eye for the last year. Severus always smirking at her. Phileas and Pomona had been sending her pitying looks. She had taken to wander the halls as a cat most of time. Minerva was proud of the young Potter for seeing through the blonde buffoon so easily, though. At least that was one genius who wasn't a regurgitator. The old lioness had always held a soft spot for James and Lily's son. But she would be a fool to suggest that the boy was remotely like his parents. Nature versus nurture, she supposed. She shook herself out of her musings and let out a sigh at the sight of the girl who was supposed to be the brightest witch of her generation rocking back and forth, sobbing as she held on to wrestling with werewolves for dear life. Sometimes she hated her job. Breaking news. A mass murderer named Sirius Black has escaped high-security prison. Police are on the outlook, but if anyone encounters him, please do not approach. That was the thing that Rai was forgetting. Black was innocent, of course, and Rai had known this, but why had he forgotten? Probably fate's doing. Anyhow, he would deal with his later. He had a war to stop in India. That, and Marge was visiting. Even the Noblesse's charm didn't work on that creature. So Rai decided that stopping a war between the Naga and the Indian fairies who'd been in dispute for millennia would be easier than to breathe the same air as Margaret Dudley. "Hello, Uncle Mooney," was Rai's first words to the ragged-looking Professor R. J. Lupin after 12 years, who was looking stunned, for some strange reason. Rai was more stunned at his decision to wear that coat. Wasn't he a wizard? Why was he wearing such a disgraceful piece of clothing? Hello to you too, Rai. How do you remember me after such a long time? Rai paid him no mind as he pulled out his wand, which was stark white and set with rubies. Lupin grew even more alarmed. Maybe this was Black polyjuiced as Rai. Before the werewolf was able to draw his own wand, however, he was enveloped in warmth. Bright colors swirled around him, causing him to close his sensitive werewolf eyes. When he opened them again, Rai was pocketing his wand, and he smiled at Lupin. A minuscule smile, but a smile nonetheless with an approving look. What was that? Rai raised an eyebrow and conjured a mirror. Lupin ignored that conjuring was taught in 6th year and started. Instead of his rags, he was now wearing red-colored robes of high quality, with details that formed like claws. Werewolf claws. Lupin tore his eyes from his reflection and stared at his increasingly mysterious pseudo-godson. Why? Rai frowned and tilted his head in confusion. What do you mean, why? I can't have any uncle of mine running around in whatever you were wearing. And I'll be sending you a wardrobe of other robes, too. I have an image to uphold. With that, Rai pulled out a book from wherever and sat down and read for the rest of train ride. Lupin just sighed. He was probably imagining this. He looked in the mirror again. Probably not. So, Rai, how was summer? Oh, stopped a war that was brewing for millennia by getting people from both sides to talk about it like adults. Also had to win their trust by doing some simple tasks. Like, for example, there was this giant Quetzalcoatl that both sides were afraid of, for some reason, and when I killed it, they seemed to like me. Anyway, what about you? That was you? Yes. Are you okay, Patil? You seem to have trouble breathing? Rai. Yes, Sue? Never change. I wasn't planning to. Why do you ask such strange things of me? Chapter 6. Sirius Black was a free man, which confused him. The reason for his confusion was of course his de facto son, who, by the looks of it, didn't actually strictly need a parent, but still, he was Sirius's godson and that counted for something, at least. But all of that was a matter for another time. Right now, he needed to find said godson. Sirius hadn't even met the not exactly little, but medium-sized guy. Rai reached Sirius' shoulders at this point, and Sirius was 5 feet 10 inches, so he was medium-sized. Right. Sirius needed to find his medium-sized godson to ask him what the hell was going on. All the last lord of the noble and ancient house of Black knew that he'd been summoned by someone in the ministry for a trial after the lazy sods had finally bothered to look up the fact that he'd never been given a freaking trial in the first place. So Sirius had pawed his way to the ministry on the given date, which would have been stupid if it wasn't Amelia Bones who'd offered him a trial. After he'd arrived, he'd shocked the living daylights of several reporters, among them Rita Skeeter, which pleased him to no end as he hated that bitch. But then Sirius himself had been surprised when Amelia had brought in the rat. They had subjected Sirius to the Veritaserum first, as he was the apparent victim, which he was happy to do. Then the rat had been forced to confess, and soon after the judgment that Sirius Orion Black was innocent was delivered, along with the announcement that the ministry would compensate him. Where does Rai come in, you ask? Well, Sirius had noticed his godson's presence almost immediately, which was an easy feat considering everybody else was already muttering about Rai. Sirius' chest swelled with pride. Rai was class personified, and clothed in black robes with gold accents and red-colored details swirling about, he looked like a true heir. And Sirius really liked the cross his godson had dangling from his ear. Rai's presence had caused Sirius to be slightly nervous, as he felt guilty for running after the rat, and not staying back to take care of his pseudo-son who'd just lost his parents. Thankfully, the trial had processed smoothly, almost to an unnatural extent. Then, when Amelia was done with the official announcements, she'd also thanked Rai for apparently bringing their attention to his case. And there was where the crux of the matter lay. How had Rai even known that he, Sirius Orion Black, had never received a trial? He spotted his godson talking to a reasonably well-dressed man who was crying. Why was he crying? Wait, was that Remus? Now Sirius was even more confused. Remus and the words reasonably well-dressed had never gone together before. Some of it was because of lack of funds on Remus' part, but it was mostly because being a werewolf apparently messed with one's fashion sense. Really bad. And this was coming from Sirius, who hadn't seen a shop for the past 12 years. As Sirius approached the duo of his only living best friend and their best friend's only son, his steps turned uncertain. Was he even welcome? Did Rai even want him? Did Remus really believe him? All of these thoughts flew out the window as Remus embraced him in a bear hug, almost squishing Sirius to death, which would have slightly anticlimactic if Sirius was honest. I'm so sorry, so sorry, so sorry, so sorry, Remus almost chanted in Sirius' ear. Thankfully, Rai had noticed the decidedly blue color his godfather was taking, which he reasoned would have to be a bad thing. The Noblesse didn't want a blue godfather. Rai cleared his throat, causing Remus to finally notice Sirius' current condition and letting him go, and following that with another batch of apologies. He'd thankfully stopped crying at this point. Sirius coughed, trying to catch his breath. Not your fault. Now, is this Rai? Sirius wheezed. Whoa, yes. Isn't he? Well, there aren't really enough words to describe our dear godson, Remus said with a proud smile. Rai's lips tugged to the side to form a slight smile. Nice to see you again, Padfoot. Sirius was dumbfounded and stood stock still for a whole minute before he broke down and fell to his knees. You remembered. You remembered. Now Rai was looking slightly more uncomfortable, but he reached and hesitantly patted Sirius' head, like he would have done to Frankenstein. Thankfully, it seemed to calm the dogman down. Remus watched the scene unfold with amusement. He knew that crying people were the one thing Rai didn't quite know how to handle. Come off it. The boy is a genius after all. Now let's get you some food and a shower. Rai will probably insist on new clothes. Remus trailed off, trying to get his best friend to come to his senses. Sirius did a full 180 at hearing the word clothes. Oh, where are we shopping? Twilfit? The Madam? Or the Muggle world? The man said brightly. Rai blinked in surprise, before chalking it up to things humans did. Remus smiled. That always worked. Ex-convict or Sirius Black was a fashionista at heart. October 31st, 4th year. Rai was enjoying his chocolate cake with his tea. Sully had not long ago recommended the heavenly treat known as chocolate to him, along with coffee, but tea was so much more Rai's style, so he didn't bother with that. Rai was pretty sure Sue regretted introducing chocolate to him, as evidenced by the look of despair on her face, but Rai chose to ignore that. He scanned over the teacher's table and frowned. Snape had accidentally told the entire Slytherin house that Remus was a werewolf. So Remus had resigned, which bothered Rai more than it should have, which was the reason that Snape had mysteriously gone bald. Of course, no one, not even Snape, suspected that it was him, as he'd never uttered the word prank, much less participated in one. Rai suspected that Dumbledore knew that it was him, as Snape still hadn't managed to get his hair back. Rai had debated giving Snape his hair because of sheer aesthetics, as a bald Snape was uglier than before. He'd heard Neville Longbottom had fainted once he saw the Dungeon Bat's new appearance. Another reason for his frown was the new addition to the table, Mad-Eye Moody, who wasn't really moody. It was part of Fate's plan, which Rai had found stupider as time went by. But still, Fate wasn't to be liked, only to happen. So Rai had turned a blind eye to Mad-Eye. This year, Fate's stupid plan involved the Triwizard Tournament. And today, they were going to announce the participants. Rai was 99.99% sure that he was going to be one of them, even though he didn't want to. The champion for Durmstrang, Victor Krum, Dumbledore was announcing jovially. A slightly familiar face rose from the Slytherin table. He must have been one of those Quidditch players. Sirius and Remus had dragged him to the World Cup finale. Against his will. The champion for Beauxbatons, Fleur Delacour. The Vila. She annoyed Rai, mainly because she had made it her goal to seduce him. He wagered that it meant that she wanted to mate with him, but Rai was an ancient non-gendered entity, so she'd probably fail. The champion for Hogwarts, Cedric Diggory. Diggory was one of the bearable humans, so Rai graced him with a smile when their eyes met. Diggory did an impressive impression of a goldfish in response. And now the goblet flared to life again. Rai sighed inwardly. Everybody in the hall leaned forward, eager to hear whatever that came out of the headmaster's mouth. Harry Potter. Sorry, Rai, my dear boy. It seems someone wanted to trick you into competing. Rai had gone completely still at hearing his name. Many of the Ravenclaws close to him inched away. The students shared frightened glances, while the Furstis and the foreigners looked confused. It was a well-known fact that Rai was a powerful wizard. It was also known that the only thing that irritated him was the name Harry, especially when addressed to him. Everyone bated their breaths. Sully had left the Ravenclaw table at this point. Suddenly, every piece of unused or empty glassware lifted from all the tables. Dumbledore was sweating now, looking almost older than he was, an amazing feat. Rai took a deep breath, which was heard clearly over the silent hall. Slowly, the glassware lowered itself to the tables. There was a collective sigh of relief. I don't know what just happened, but, well you see, the moment someone's name is entered and called from the goblet, they enter a magical contract. So if Harry dash, as soon as those words left Crouch's mouth, the goblet burst into millions of pieces. Silence. Then Barty Crouch Sr. was subjected to hundreds of glares. Among them was Dumbledore, who had the darkest look Crouch Sr. had seen in recent years. The politician felt himself shrink. Rai took another deep breath and pinched the bridge of his nose. Every eye was on him again. Most of them looked concerned, while the Fursties and foreigners looked anywhere from impressed to scared out of their wits. Rai fixed Crouch Sr. with a stare. Like father, like son, he guessed. Is the contract still active? Rai said in an emotionless voice. Crouch was sweating buckets now. Even Karkaroff looked at him with disdain. Well, yes. The man said in a small voice. Silence again. Rai sighed. Oh well, might as well do it. The most powerful wizard to exist said. Rai looked expectantly at Dumbledore, who motioned to the chamber the rest of the champions were. Rai walked to the chamber. Before he entered, he scanned the crowd. You may have already noticed, he enunciated slowly, but I really did not enter this fad of a competition of my own free will. With that, he turned and entered the antechamber. Dumbledore and the others entered after him, all of them refusing to meet each other's eyes. The champions had snuck out to see what was holding the staff up, were also staring at anything but Rai. Crumb found the spiderweb beside the fireplace particularly interesting, while Diggory and Delacour had developed a fascination with the floor. This went on for 10 minutes. Even fake Mad Eye was intimidated. Karkaroff and Maxime didn't even dare to allude that Hogwarts had cheated. Rai sighed again. Why? Are we here, Professor? I want to sleep. The Noblesse said in a slightly irritated voice. Dumbledore looked at Minerva desperately, who was the only one unfazed by the whole ordeal. The Transfiguration Professor, known to be Rai's favorite out of the teachers, cleared her throat. Well, Mr. Potter, we were to congratulate all of the champions on being chosen and give you a hint of the first task, which is that you'll need to think on your feet, and your survival skills will be tested. You're forbidden from seeking help from teachers, though that rule is generally ignored, so feel free to reach out, though I doubt you'll need it. That's all. You may retire to your dorm. The Cat Animagus said in curt, clinical tone. Rai left, with a nod of acknowledgement towards Minerva. The chamber remained silent for a long time, before everyone looked at each other, sighed, and just left. Though Crouch Sr. was the subject of several glares. A single beetle who'd been spying on the whole thing shuddered, and decided not to publish anything other than facts about Hadrian Potter. Rai slept surprisingly well that day. November 1st, the next day would always be remembered as the day that Rai received his first howler. Hadrian James Potter. I don't even know what to say, Sirius I should probably feel proud that you managed to enter a deadly tournament without even trying Sirius. But as a parent, I must remind you, what do I remind him, Remus? Oh yeah, not to die. That would be bad. So don't die. And socialize Why are you even sending him a howler, you idiot? Because I want to, Remus. Also, is it every day that he enters a competition? He doesn't even speak more than 100 words per day. This is an opportunity, I tell you Shut up, sorry about that, Rai. I'll kill him. Dead silence. Sue. Why yes, Rai. Have you ever tried to kill your godfather? No. Oh well. Chapter 7. Wand Weighing Ceremony. Dumbledore watched as Ollivander weighed the wands and tested them out. Of course, the most unique was wand Mr. Potter's, a fact that Dumbledore had taken for a given lately. Ollivander didn't even touch it, but asked Rai to produce a Patronus. Even Rai blinked in surprise. Rita Skeeter, who had been unnaturally professional to this point, perked up. How do you know I have a Patronus? Rai asked, intrigued by the oddball wandmaker who was more in touch with magic than any wizard he'd met. Ollivander shrugged. I would honestly be surprised if you could not produce a Patronus. A wizard of your caliber would not be daunted by much. Rai gave one of his almost smiles at that, and all the females in the room swooned, while the cameraman snapped a quick picture. Expecto Patronum. Rai intoned calmly. A large wyvern formed, breathing magic, before it disappeared out the room. Silence. Rai smiled again, and naturally the photographer clicked away. The champions minus Diggory sent Rai odd and fearful looks, while the Hufflepuff just smiled, fighting to keep his laughter at the ridiculous expressions everyone had. Ollivander looked pleased. In perfect condition. And an impressive Patronus, Mr. Potter, the wandmaker said in an enthusiastic tone. Rita Skeeter just stared. Why am I even surprised at this point? Next thing I know he can fly. Dumbledore muttered, defeated. Rai twitched. First task. And now, our final and youngest champion. He may be competing against his will in a plot against his life, but he will survive. For he is Hadrian Potter, the boy who lived. The crowd roared in agreement as Bagman introduced the second Hogwarts champion, while some of the professors winced at his obliviousness. Rai stared at the fire-breathing lizard with apathy. Their first task was to get a golden egg from within a nesting dragon's clutch. Surprise, surprise, Rai had been saddled with the worst of them, the Hungarian horntail. Oh, the horror. Even if the champions weren't supposed to know about the task, Rai had accidentally gleaned it from Snape when the currently bald professor had been vividly imagining Rai's demise at the hands of a dragon during potions. Naturally, the next day Snape was mysteriously found spitting insults at every inanimate object he passed, and he was suddenly full of praise for the students. Especially Neville Longbottom, who'd been traumatized when Snape had lathered his admittedly abysmal brew with praises. Point was, Rai had known of the dragons since the teachers had, and had subsequently told Diggory. Thankfully, the Hufflepuff hadn't questioned his sources or intentions, already aware of Rai's peculiar-ness. He didn't bother to tell Delacour or Crumb, as they had already known. Diggory had already completed the task, as had the two other champions. Now Rai was left this annoyed killing machine who was itching to have a roasted noblesse for dinner. Rai's eyebrow twitched in irritation. Curse fate. He couldn't believe that he, a virtual deity, was made to do this. He may be cranky from the fact that Pettigrew had somehow escaped Azkaban, but this just made him angry. The dragon had apparently had enough of their ongoing staring match, as it suddenly gaped and aimed its fire towards Rai. Everybody in the stand screamed, afraid of seeing their beloved savior turn to dust. Sirius and Remus, who'd come to watch their pseudo-son kick some dragoness, practically shrieked in fright, though both would insist that it was a manly expression of concern afterwards. Just as the dragon flame was to roast the noblesse, he jumped 40 feet in the air. The crowd went still. Even the dragon was startled. Rai made eye contact with the dragon, who at this point looked slightly baffled, as it was still gaping, but wasn't breathing fire. Everybody held their breath at this point. Rai floated in the air for a minute, before he disappeared from sight. Everybody gasped. Then they spotted Rai, on the other side of the stadium, egg in hand, still floating in the air. Even his dogfathers gaped. Snape was practically a goldfish. The whole thing had taken him 3 seconds, tops. Then Sully let loose a whoop of joy, and soon, the rest of the Ravenclaws and the crowd joined. I don't know what just happened, and neither does that dragon, but Mr. Potter just finished his task in record time. And he's still floating. Lord Potter, if you would please join the rest of us on the ground? The dragon was indeed looking around cluelessly, but ultimately gave up, as several handlers rushed to it. The horntail looked almost relieved at seeing those familiar faces, and immediately settled down, almost purring. Charlie Weasley had stars in his eyes. He'd met his god. Rai lowered himself to the rocky stadium floor. He was immediately swarmed by Madame Pomfrey, who inspected him of any injury. Finally, she declared him fit as a fiddle, and went back to the tent where the other champions were resting, muttering about reckless, overpowered teenagers. And now, the score. 5 judges who could give a total of 10 numbers. Of course, Rai got all of them. Karkaroff tried to give him a 5, but ultimately changed his mind, remembering the fate of the goblet. Everybody cheered. Rai just wanted some ramen. So, did you work out the clue? Yes, I did, Diggory. Really? Wow, I wouldn't even have thought about putting it in the water by myself. Who said anything about water? Well, now that I think about it, Mermish might sound better underwater. What?
What?
Nothing. Never change, Rai. I wasn't planning to. Why does everyone say that? Would you like to accompany me to the ball, Sue? Rai asked his only female acquaintance who didn't make him abandon this planet and ultimately cause the apocalypse. I thought you'd want to go with that Delacour girl. Didn't she ask you? Sue said with a raised eyebrow. She is just, playing around. I want to go with a girl who understands that I do not have any intention whatsoever of a romantic relationship. Ever. So, you want to go to the ball with me because I'm not attracted to you? Well, yes. Oh, God. Is that a yes? Yes. Good. Oh, I will send you a dress. You have a terrible sense of fashion, you know? On the night of the Yule Ball, everyone only noticed one couple. Rai and Sue. Both of them were wearing matching outfits. Sue was wearing a blood-red evening gown with gold accents and black details, while Rai was wearing high-class robes in black, with gold accents and red details. Fleur gaped at Sue's dress. Without a thought, she went over to her as the first dance was done. Rai had left the ball as soon as it was done, and now Sue was enjoying the attentions of all in attendance and dancing with a number of guys. Fleur pulled her to the side, startling the poor girl out of her wits. I am so sorry about that, but where did you get that dress? There was a crazed look in the Vila's eyes, and she was almost vibrating with excitement. Rai gave it to me. Fleur stilled. Rai. Yes. A determined look came over the Vila's face. The next day, Fleur sought out Rai, who was somewhat startled to see the Vila with another purpose than seducing him on her mind. After a lengthy discussion, Rai decided that he liked Fleur once she wasn't licking her lips at him. At least she had a sense for fashion. Second task. Rai jumped in the water. Contrary to popular belief, he liked swimming. He reached Suli in no time and freed her. Then he saw another Vila, similar to Fleur in looks. He was immediately filled with disgust. Exposing such a young Vila to cold water of this degree would affect their magic. Rai truly hated the wizards sometimes. They were risking a child's future for some stupid task. No wonder Fleur had been so frantic. He freed the poor child and tugged both Sue and the child out of the water. The merman didn't even react, his feel of his magic already scaring them into submission. Rai broke to the surface, with both Sue and the child. The crowd cheered. Mr. Potter is first, as usual. That should be enough for a full pot once again. Fleur was already there, having been defeated by the Grindylows. If she had been a human, the Grindylows wouldn't even be able to think about her, but since she was literally out of her element, she had been defeated. As soon as she saw Rai dragging both her sister and Suli out of the water, she almost jumped him. Nevertheless, she burst into tears and hugged her poor sister and thanked Rai extensively. Rai gave the judges a dark look, a look that put fear even in Dumbledore. The Noblesse walked over to the judges' table. Dumbledore, sensing a storm, stayed silent. Percy Weasley, who was filling in for Crouch Sr., had the dubious honor of talking to the savior. Rai, what is the matter? The recent graduate asked hesitantly, aware of Rai's reputation. What's the matter? The Noblesse asked in a low, dangerous voice. The judges sweated under his silent glare. Everybody in the crowd watched the conversation with trepidation. You ask me what's the matter? You put a child Vila in a freezing lake filled with dangerous animals and ask me what's the matter? Rai's voice had sunk to a low whisper at this point, yet everybody heard him as if he was screaming. I knew that wizards were stupid and ignorant of other races, but I thought they had the common sense and humanity to not put children in danger, especially not for their amusement. Everybody flinched. Even a couple of purebloods bowed their heads in shame. Rai straightened his back and left, not even waiting for the rest to come back. Fleur smiled through her tears. She finally understood now. Rai wasn't someone she could even dream of having as a lover. He just wasn't human enough for that. And deities don't love the way humans do. Third task. Rai navigated through the maze, coming to the center first out of luck than anything else. He had a 15-minute lead on everyone else, and he'd only been in the maze for 10, and he'd only met a Sphinx, who had asked about a spider, and an Acromantula, who didn't even bother attacking him. So Rai finished the third task before any of the other champions had even begun. As soon as he touched the cup, he was transported to a graveyard, where Pettigrew and a deformed baby was waiting for him. Looks like he'd finally get to start mission, save wizards from their own stupidity. How great. Chapter 8. Marvolo stared at his lord. They were still in the graveyard, with Pettigrew still unconscious and Rai still bleeding. Marvolo had no special reason for his staring. But did he really need one? Honestly, he was so dumbfounded by the day's turn of events that the only thing he could do was to stare at the creature that was his new master. Rai seemed untroubled by the whole ordeal, but Voldemort hardly expected him to be fazed by this. As old as he claimed to be, this must have been something normal. It's not normal. Huh. I said that it's not normal for me to contract servants. Did I say that out loud? No, but you're practically screaming your thoughts. It's quite annoying. Marvolo blinked, already having exceeded his limit of being shocked to do much else. Rai had mentioned something about a mental bond, hadn't he? Don't worry overly much, I don't plan on listening for too long. But there are some things in your head that need my attention. Marvolo tilted his head to the side. What did he mean by that? Haven't you wondered why you're so sane after having torn your soul? Though my blood helped your soul to assemble, it's my presence that allowed you to come back to sanity. Without me, you'd probably develop some type of schizophrenia, as your Horcruxes are different pieces of you at different times. You'd be a 16-year-old on second and a 60-year-old the next. Rai answered tonelessly. Marvolo nodded to himself. That made a lot of sense. He inspected Rai's injuries again. Don't worry about it. I need a good excuse for having gone AWOL from Hogwarts. As he said that, Rai motioned to Pettigrew's motionless body and levitated it. Marvolo raised an eyebrow. Pettigrew would be the excuse. Rai nodded, and Marvolo tried to pretend this conversation wasn't creepy. He cleared his throat. Why are you here? I mean, well, your presence in a dimension different than your own. Must have some kind of a reason? Yes. Its mission, save wizards from their own stupidity. What? Do you even realize how stupid you are being? First of all, the whole blood purity thing. No, blood does not control the amount of power a wizard has. It is a blessing of magic. That's it. And then there is the whole dark magic versus light. Where do you even begin with that one? Magic is just magic. It's your intentions that matter. The master ranted, letting his tight grip in his magic come loose in his frustration. Voldemort shivered as he felt Rai's aura envelop the graveyard. He truly did not want to anger this person. But once again, he was left with as many questions as answers. What did he mean? No dark or light. Then why did Voldemort feel a different sensation when performing dark magic than when he performed light? Rai sighed. That's your own core magic responding to your intentions. Magic in general, however, remains boringly neutral. Tempest. Voldemort startled at the sudden use of the spell, having not expected that. Rai paid him no attention. He brought the floating pettigrew towards him and gingerly placed a finger on the cleanest part of the rat's clothes. 8:30 p.m. It is getting late. I'm afraid that we'll have to cut our talk short. I'll contact you when I need to. Don't try to gather those baboons of yours. They'll be a hindrance, and I'd rather not deal with more idiotic humans than I have to. Oh, make that mark of yours go away. It is essential to our plans. And before I forget, don't bother calling Barty Crouch Jr. He's a bit too far gone to be useful to us. Accio Cup. With that, the Noblesse left, Pettigrew in tow. Voldemort stared at the place where he'd been for a long, long time. That was the first time in his almost 70 years of life that Voldemort drank himself to a stupor. Lucius Malfoy stared at the mess that had once been the fearful Dark Lord. So, the Noblesse? The Malfoy Lord asked with a raised eyebrow, mouth twitching upwards when the terrifying Dark Lord groaned despondently from his position on the floor of the Malfoy Manor foyer. Others may not believe it, but the Lucius had always thought of Voldemort as a cool uncle, if slightly ugly because honestly, who gives up their nose for their cause? That's what he called stupid dedication. They were quite close behind the scenes, and Lucius liked to believe that the Malfoys were the only family their lord had ever had. Therefore, Lucius was probably the only one with who could get away with laughing at the man known as He Who Must Not Be Named. Of course, there was another reason for him finding the situation absolutely hilarious. Look at the bright side, Lucius said, helpfully, barely suppressing his laughter. You're immortal since you're virtually impossible to beat. Your mind is finally working, and most importantly, Lucius paused again to swallow his laughter. You have a nose. And hair. Marvolo lifted his head and glared at his pseudo-nephew. As soon as their eyes met, however, Lucius lost it and broke out in thigh-slapping laughter, holding his stomach as he wiped his tears of mirth. Marvolo blinked in shock. Never had any Malfoy laughed so hard, let alone in front of him. Marvolo sent Lucius a concerned look and approached him slowly. Lucius, are you okay? The Darkest Lord in history asked, a trickle of fear in his voice. Lucius seemed to calm down for a moment. I can't believe that Snort Master would do that. With that, Lucius broke into laughter again. Marvolo went still. Master? What do you mean? The poor man asked, looking lost. Lucius finally controlled his laughter and smirked. It wasn't like his usual smirk though, which was more haughty with a holier-than-thou feel. It was more dangerous and carried a hint of madness. Marvolo felt a shiver of fear throughout his very being. Lucius bowed towards Marvolo mockingly. I was once known as Frankenstein in a different dimension. I am the Noblesse's other servant. Marvolo looked faint. And you're senior. Marvolo stared at his pseudo-nephew turned. Whatever the fuck they were. Lucius Frankenstein righted himself from the bow, and his expression turned rather businesslike. Marvolo shivered in fear again. Now, as your senior, I am in charge of getting you to know yourself and your new powers. Of course, our goal is to help Master in his holy mission of save wizards from their own stupidity dash. How do you even exist here? Huh? Oh, Master visited once after his second year, because he figured I had placed your diary Horcrux in Hogwarts dash. You did what? Anyway, he'd intercepted it, and to both of our surprise that we met each other. Of course, the meeting led to me recovering my memories, and I've been helping our cause since then. Anyway, back to the topic at hand dash. The longer he listened, the crazier the situation got. For the first time in his life, Voldemort regretted everything he'd done to piss Fate off. Dimensions away, the entity known as Fate felt happy for some reason. It chalked it up to Raizel. That guy never let Fate down, after all. Chapter 9. Cornelius Fudge was staring guilelessly at the person in front of him, which so happened to be the center of attention, Hadrian Potter, newly crowned winner of the Triwizard Tournament. They were currently in the Hogwarts hospital wing. They meaning the Hogwarts staff, a Ravenclaw girl that Fudge vaguely remembered to be Potter's date at the Yule Ball, Potter's godfather, and the werewolf who Fudge didn't really know, and Amelia Bones and some of the Aurors. One of the reasons for their current gathering was, of course, Potter. who had been bleeding profusely from his arm and forehead, but looked fine otherwise, if you ignored the dangerously pale pallor his skin was taking. Madame Pomfrey was glaring daggers at all of them, and Cornelius felt himself shrink. He should be sleeping, Dumbledore. Don't you see how pale he's become? I've seen ghosts with more color. I feel like I should take offense to that. The only thing you should be taking is a sleeping draft. Speaking of which, why hasn't this disappointment of a man woken up yet? Just a slightly overpowered stunning spell, madam. Said disappointment was the second reason for their impromptu gathering. One of the most sought-after criminals in modern-day magical society, Peter Pettigrew. Needless to say, Cornelius did not see this situation occurring when he woke up this morning. His day had started off terribly. He hadn't had more than 2 hours of sleep, because even though he may be somewhat incompetent, which he would deny if asked, he still was the Minister of Magic. And Cornelius hadn't gotten to his seat without some political maneuvering, so he had to do something to repay his benefactors. Point was, he'd woken up with a terrible headache, and had thereafter dealt with several diplomats, which had only worsened the throbbing in his head. Let it never be said that Cornelius didn't appreciate PEPUPS. Then he'd attended the final task of the prestigious Triwizard Tournament, which was when thing had gone haywire, and it all involved Potter. It had been painfully obvious that someone was trying, and failing, to kill Potter by having him participate in this competition. Therefore, it was only natural that mass panic occurred when the boy had disappeared to God knows where the instant he'd touched the cup. They were all watching from a magical monitor. That had been 3 hours ago. Fudge wasn't afraid to admit that he would never look at teenage fangirls without fear again. Honestly, what were they feeding them? On those fangirls' demand, the Aurors were called with Amelia Bones at the helm, and within the first half hour of the Savior's unplanned trip, the whole of magical Britain was at Fudge's throat, demanding why wasn't this stopped when everybody in the freaking country had foreseen this to be coming, and he better be ready for impeachment. To sum it up, the 3 hours that Potter was missing was the most miserable hours of Fudge's insignificant life. Thank the powers that be that Potter had showed up alive, albeit looking a bit worse for wear, with an unconscious Peter Pettigrew in tow, which led to this situation where Fudge currently found himself in, as he patiently waited for Pomfrey to finish treating the boy savior. Said matron pursed her lips in dissatisfaction as she once again gave Potter a once-over. You've lost a lot of blood, Mr. Potter. I'm surprised that you've managed to not lose consciousness. I'm assigning you some blood replenishers, as well as some sleeping draft, she said as she placed said potions on Potter's bedside table. She rose from her seat beside her patient's side and walked towards Pettigrew. She muttered a few spells. Apparently those must have failed, as she turned towards Potter with a frown. Why isn't he waking up? I thought you said that he was just stunned, she inquired. Potter sighed. I'll wake him when it is necessary, but unfortunately that isn't now. Director Bones, the boy said authoritatively. Amelia righted herself, standing upright like she would in front of a superior. I have found the perpetrator of my unwilling admission into this farce. Everyone paid attention now. Fudge twirled his bowler in his hands. Out of the corner of his eye, Dumbledore saw Moody tints. No way. It is that man. The one who is pretending to be Alastor Moody. Pandemonium occurred as said person tried to escape, but was suddenly stopped by invisible bounds. Everyone looked for the source of the magic. It turned out to be Dumbledore. Said Headmaster swallowed a lump in his throat inaudibly. How could he have missed this? He had just thought that his friend had just gotten more eccentric, and not even thought of him being behind the crime. He levitated the now struggling man into a chair he knew to be especially uncomfortable and bound him to it. Who are you? The old man asked in a heavy voice. The room was quiet, knowing when to be cautious of the old headmaster's temper, except Fudge, who had felt, non-existing, authority be challenged by both Dumbledore and Potter. The man stepped forward pompously. Now, Dumbledore, we don't know if this indeed is the perpetrator. The boy could be lying dash. He was immediately pelted with several glares from all across the room. Even the presumed criminal stopped struggling and stared at Fudge like he was the biggest idiot to walk the earth. Fudge decided to put his foot further in his mouth. But dash. Dude, just shut up. Fudge startled as the now confirmed to be someone other than Moody intervened. Fudge decided that he'd sit this one out. He was clearly out of his depth. He'd just let Lucius deal with this mess. Dumbledore chose to ignore Fudge's presence as a whole and get on with it. Amelia, do we have your permission to use Veritaserum? Just then, fake Moody's body started to contort. His fake eye fell out with a sickening noise out of his socket. His fake leg fell off in the same fashion. The room watched with morbid fascination as the former Auror turned to a Death Eater. Amelia stared at the face of a killer thought to be dead. Go ahead, Headmaster. As Barty Crouch Jr. revealed everything he had been responsible for, under the influence of Veritaserum, Fudge thought of a strategy to get the situation under his control. Bartemius Crouch Jr., you are hereby arrested and charged with patricide, attempted homicide, and several other offenses. Just be sure that I'll see you get kissed. That doesn't matter, now does it? Now that my master is back? The clearly unhinged man said in an ecstatic tone. Amelia signed to the Aurors to take the murdering psycho into custody, and Dumbledore sent Snape and McGonagall to check on the real Moody, who was apparently trapped in a chest. As the Auror sans Amelia escorted the lunatic on death row out, Fudge cleared his throat, once again trying to establish himself as the alpha male in the room. I would like very much to know how this boy knew of the criminal in our cohorts. He may very well be in cahoots with him, trying to earn himself glory dash. Rye, what happened? And why was Crouch talking about Voldemort's return? Dumbledore interrupted Fudge, still bent on ignoring the frog's existence. Does he know how pathetic he looks? Sirius muttered to Remus, who shook his head. Rye looked at Dumbledore, apparently having agreed to do the same as the old man regarding the minister. Well, when I touched the cup, I was transported to a graveyard. There, Pettigrew greeted me, rather rudely with a stunning spell. Rye stopped for dramatic effect. The people of the room held their breaths. Disoriented as I wasn't able to avoid it. Next thing I know, I am tied to a statue, with the rat extracting my blood. Rye motioned to his arm, which was now in a sling. Sully, who had been somewhat quiet during the whole affair, let out a displeased hiss, scaring Fudge out of wits. Anyway, I gathered from Pettigrew that there was a traitor hidden in Hogwarts, and let slip his identity. He was never good with secrets, that one. Sirius, we do not joke about that. Continuing, he was making a potion of some sort in this huge cauldron. Apparently, it was to revive his master. Dumbledore drew a sharp breath, and Fudge began to sweat buckets. He added my blood and his hand to the potion, which is why he is missing one, and lastly added this disfigured baby to the mix. That's when things went kind of awry for him. Rye paused, to catch his breath. He was tired, after all. Long story short, my scar started to hurt like crazy, and suddenly 6 weird items and a snake came from nowhere and exploded into tiny pieces. Next thing I know, the cauldron has blown up, and Pettigrew is seeking cover. As I said, I too was in pain. My scar was bleeding, and it was not like regular blood. Rye paused, this time to observe Dumbledore as the gears turned in the old man's head. The reason for Rye twisting the truth was simple. He needed Dumbledore to believe Voldemort to be dead. And then? Sirius said impatiently. Remus sent Rye an apologetic look as he smacked the back of his dogfather's head. Rye smiled in approval. I think I lost consciousness for a moment. When I opened my eyes, I was free of my bindings, and Pettigrew was out cold. I stunned him just in case. And then I summoned the cup, and was portkeyed here. Silence enveloped the hospital wing as they all processed the information. Fudge broke it. Preposterous dash. Cornelius, please stop before you embarrass the Wizarding Society further. Mr. Potter, please lift your spell from the criminal. Amelia Bones intervened, tired of Fudge's antics. Finite, Rye muttered as he waved his hand. Master dash. Peter Oswald Pettigrew, you are hereby under arrest for homicide, kidnapping, and several other crimes dash. Like offending the human race with your face. Black, shut up, though I do agree. Anyway, you won't be getting any less than a kiss this time. The director of the DMLE delivered the sentence as she conjured magic blocking shackles. My master will save me, just you wait. The traitor cackled. Amelia smacked him with a silencio and took her leave with the rat in tow, dragging a dumbfounded Fudge with her. Dumbledore smiled. I think it is best that you sleep and recover, Rye. We will hold the winning ceremony tomorrow. Rye nodded his agreement and downed the potions, almost immediately falling asleep. Tomorrow marked the beginning of the mission, and he'd rather be well rested for it. Chapter 10. Malfoy Manor. A couple of weeks later. Rye swished his tea around in his cup, a satisfied smile on his face as he brought it to his lips. He was at his servant's home, and they were currently seated in the extravagantly decorated lounge. The room was decked in dark colors with hints of silver and white appearing as the light from the newly installed electric bulbs in the chandeliers hit them. As expected, Frankenstein, now known as Lucius Malfoy, outdid himself. Rye could always count on his faithful servant to know just what he needed. Speaking of which, he needed to get an update on how his newest servant, Marvolo, formerly Lord Voldemort, notorious Snakeface, was faring. Compliments on the tea, Frankenstein. Marvolo, how is your training going? Are you able to keep up? The most feared Dark Lord in modern wizarding history lifted his head up, his face the picture of desperation. The man had looked like he was on the verge of a breakdown, with deep dark circles blemishing his handsome face. He also had an assortment of bruises of various colors and sizes covering likely his entire body, as they were visible to Rye as they disappeared underneath the clothing. Until Rye had called on him, the poor man had been rocking back and forth on the floor before he had curled into a fetal position. Rye winced in slight sympathy and sent Frankenstein a reprimanding look. The latter had the sense to look somewhat ashamed. Nevertheless, even if his newly acquired servant looked somewhat beat up, Rai knew that the man had improved leaps and bounds. The biggest testimony to this being that Rai couldn't hear his thoughts even with him being in this condition. Clearing his throat, Marvolo uncurled himself from his fetal position before he stood up and bowed to Rai. Frankenstein looked on with a glint of approval entering his deep blue eyes. Senior Frankenstein has been training with me for the last few weeks, though months would likely be a better term, as we have used time turners quite generously. Rai shot Frankenstein another sharp look. Time turners were dangerous, and fate hated them with a passion. The amount of raw, natural magic that was lost during a single minute of such usage would likely be equal to that of the amount of magic that was upholding the wards of Hogwarts, which would have been fine if it didn't leave a trace on the existence of magic itself. He would certainly be having a word with his servant afterward. Frankenstein felt shiver through his body. Frankenstein, on his part, felt a shiver through his body. His master had never sent such a disapproving look, not even when he had been creating trouble for his master by fighting the clan leaders. Rai turned his attention back towards Marvolo, who had been watching their silent interaction curiously. Why are you still standing? Sit. Now, on to important matters. I want you, Marvolo, to apply for the defense position at Hogwarts. Your backstory will be that you are a bastard son of Voldemort, one that he had no idea existed. Your mother raised you in complete secrecy for fear that Voldemort might convert you to a murdering psychopath. Also that she was a muggle-born. Is that acceptable? Marvolo blinked in surprise before his face broke into a genuine smile. Aspirations for world dominance aside, he had always wanted to teach. He nodded eagerly to show that yes, it was acceptable. In fact, it was more than acceptable. Rai smiled slightly at seeing the enthusiasm of his servant. Frankenstein will provide you with the necessary documents to prove your identity. As for Dumbledore, don't worry. He wholeheartedly believes that Voldemort is dead. The disappearance of the dark mark on your followers was enough to convince him. It will also be easier for us to meet up if you're at Hogwarts. That aside, I want to see how much you've progressed. Rai reminded Marvolo. The former Dark Lord immediately turned serious. What would you have me do? Rai thought for a moment before he answered. Your weakness seems to be that of physical combat. But I also want to see how much you've progressed with the powers you have newly acquired. As such, I want you to penetrate my shield just using your new powers. Keep in mind that you cannot use the same attack twice. If you manage to break my shield, we'll have a physical spar. Marvolo nodded. That seemed to be a reasonable test. He immediately fell into a stance, powering up. The room shook. Frankenstein's eyes widened. Not here, Marvolo. If you break any of the decorative items here, Narcissa will skin us alive. Master, why don't I show you the dueling room? Rai blinked before he subtly hid a smile. Marvolo had no such inhibitions as he snorted inelegantly. Though Frankenstein was vastly different from Lucius in some aspects, he was very much in love with his wife, and much involved in his son's life as he would have been otherwise. Both Narcissa and Draco knew about the changes that happened to Lucius, and were the only other people in the know about the mission. At first, they had trouble adjusting to Lucius's personality changes, but soon found that the changes were mostly for the better. In fact, Draco had grown closer to his father, as Lucius had been a cold taskmaster at best. Even though Draco had nothing lacking materialistically, he had always longed for a father that would treat him warmly. Frankenstein, however, had been a much warmer father, and even though he didn't spoil Draco as much, Narcissa had forbidden him from entering their bedroom when Lucius had first told her of his true self. She had felt that someone else was occupying her husband's body and had almost hated Frankenstein at first. Slowly, though, she came to realize just how alike this new version of her husband was to the older version, and how much better he was than her husband. Truth to be told, Narcissa had not really loved Lucius. His treatment of those below him and his son always put her on guard, and Narcissa was sure Lucius hadn't loved her either. He had respected her and listened to her advice when she saw it fit to intervene, but he'd never loved her. This sudden change had forced the two of them to interact on a whole other level, and Narcissa had found herself falling for the man that she realized was still her husband, but so much more. Frankenstein, for his part, had not calculated that he would be falling in love. But one look at Narcissa and he knew he was gone. He'd readily agreed to everything she'd suggested. And he loved Draco too, even if the boy had been spoiled too much. He supposed it came from his longing for a family of his own, not to mention that no matter what Narcissa believed, Lucius had been head over heels for her. He just didn't know how to show his emotions. Frankenstein's original family had died a horrible death at the hand of a plague. It was one of the reasons he'd become so invested in science and then power. So he was happy to have finally found someone he could truly love. Marvolo thought the whole thing was a cosmic joke and had dismissed it with that. While he was happy that his pseudo-nephew had been able to finally open up, he didn't quite understand the concept of love and probably never would. All thanks to the way he was conceived. Strangely though, after his soul had been reunited, he had begun to feel more of these positive emotions. Before he had chosen to rip his own soul apart, the only emotion that had even vaguely resembled positivity had been the feeling of being satisfied. He'd never experienced even slight affection towards something, not even himself, which was probably why he'd had so few problems with ripping his soul into several pieces, now that he thought about it. The only emotions he had vast experiences with were anger, disappointment, agony, and possessiveness. The reason he was obsessed with Hogwarts wasn't that he had been attached, but because he was possessive of the castle. Because he had been the heir of Slytherin, he had felt a certain claim over the castle. He wasn't even sure what his objective for immortality was. It wasn't like Marvolo had a burning passion for the so-called pure-blood agenda, not when it essentially discriminated against Marvolo himself. But now, he felt passion. He felt passion toward his magic. He felt affection for his master, and he felt attached to Frankenstein. He felt amused when he saw the elder Malfoys arguing about inconsequential things, like which color would suit which room for which occasion. Something that took the married way too long to agree on, in his humble opinion. And most of all, he felt grateful. The Dark Lord was forever grateful to his new master. At first, he had been confused, flabbergasted that he had been bested so easily. But slowly, Marvolo had come to terms with his new form of existence, and he had come to respect his new lord, realizing that he had essentially been saved from a continued existence of being a hollow shell of a human with way too much power. Rai, for his part, was happy for his servant, and Narcissa was a pleasure to be around. The Noblesse had learned that she had been quite close with Sirius when they had been younger, and he could see why. Narcissa may act like she was the epitome of everything a pure-blood lady of her status, but with around those, she considered family. Her mask dropped to reveal a bold woman who wasn't above pulling a prank or two. The Guardian had been surprised to learn that Narcissa had taken to him rather quickly, and knew that the woman was loyal to him, even though it was mainly because of Frankenstein. Draco, however, had proven to be an even bigger surprise. The younger Malfoy had always treated him with respect, though he was a bit hard-headed at times when it came to matters like status. The boy was undoubtedly proud of his wealth and status as the Malfoy heir. And though he didn't quite like to show off like that awful Smith boy from Hufflepuff, he did always carry himself with an air of arrogance. Not to mention his numerous spats with the youngest Weasley. Rai almost winced when he thought about the unfortunate boy. Weasley was, in Rai's opinion, handed the wrong end of fate's stick. He was not remarkable in any way, and to top it off, he suffered from an almost crippling complex of inferiority. His elder brothers, and even his sister, surpassed him greatly in terms of magical strength. Not to mention that Rai was quite fond of the Weasley twins. The two terrors reminded Rai of Tao, and he was almost always amused by their antics as they usually left him out of their pranks. Not that they would be able to prank him anyway. In any case, it was laughably easy for anyone to rile the youngest Weasley boy up and make him embarrass himself. When they had been first years, Draco had taken great delight in doing just that. Fortunately for Weasley, Draco quickly tired of him and his predictable reactions and had found a new target, Hermione Granger. Granger was a smart Muggle-born who was magically strong. If Rai was honest, she was probably the most powerful student after himself, Draco, and Sully. But she was far from perfect. She was bossy and competitive. Plus, she had blind faith in teachers and books. When they had begun at Hogwarts, she had always treated Rai like a rival, staring at him through narrowed eyes and sniffed haughtily whenever Rai had answered a question by not quoting a book word for word. If the Noblesse was perfectly honest, it had been incredibly irritating after the first week. Thus, Granger had found herself the target of Draco's attentions. Though she was not as easy to rile up as the younger Weasley, she was still at odds with the rest of the first year for her better-than-thou attitude, so no one bothered to help her. Besides, she could her own. The only time she had needed saving was when she had been caught in a case of wrong place and wrong time at Halloween of their first year. Rai had, of course, seen through Quirrell's pathetic attempt at getting the stone and was about to leave for the Ravenclaw dormitories when Ron Weasley had run up to him. The poor boy informed him that Granger was missing and was likely in the bathroom crying. Rai had rolled his eyes and followed the boy to the bathroom and knocked the troll out by levitating his club and dropping it on the creature's head. While the two first years had been staring at him with awe, he had turned and left, not wanting to be caught in any trouble with the teachers. Thankfully, after the incident with the troll, Granger had stopped staring at him with contempt, though she still had blind faith in teachers and books. The thing that changed that was the scandal with Lockhart. It was definitely a welcome change as they had begun their third year and Granger had finally realized that the words of teachers and books were not gospel. She had begun to actually debate her conclusions and try to understand the different perspectives of people who disagreed with her. She also worked her answers differently, though at times she would still just directly quote a book. The changes had not gone unnoticed, especially not by the young Malfoy heir, who had also had several revelations broken to him during the summer of 1993, as it was that summer that Frankenstein's memories had resurfaced in Lucius. And one of the first things that Rye's old servant had been quick to erase from his child's mind was the notion of blood status having any consequence. Thus Draco had been much more open-minded to Granger's opinions and antagonized her much less. In fact, the two of them were often seen with Rye's group of friends that included the Ravenclaws in his year, plus the Weasley twins on occasion, debating the various elements of magic. Soon they became tentative friends, which had led to Draco being abandoned by the more conservative Slytherins. But the Malfoy couldn't quite bring himself to care for the lack of Crabbe and Goyle's constant presence, as it was replaced by Hermione and Blaise Zabini, who was one of the more liberal Slytherins. By their fourth year, Hermione had been someone Rye considered a friend, and someone Draco considered his best friend, and maybe more if their appearance at the Yule Ball was anything to go by. Rye shook himself out of his thoughts as they finally reached the Malfoy Manor's dueling chambers. He had a servant to test. Chapter 11. Marvolo squared his shoulders, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. They were in the dueling chambers which Frankenstein had practically warded against every known threat to man. The chamber looked to be endless as they were charmed with expansion charms that allowed them to essentially be a pocket universe. Coupled this with the wards, and no one even in the manor would notice if power equal to nuclear blast took place. Concentrating, he readied himself to attack. He knew that he had to put in a lot of effort to pass this seemingly easy task. The Dark Lord had control over his new powers, though not as much as he had control over his magic. Time stood at a standstill for a brief, serene moment. Marvolo's heartbeat quickened as he prepared himself. Jumping high in the air, he looked at the Noblesse who was calmly waiting for him to launch an attack. Their eyes met, and then they were off, Marvolo attacking with an uninhibited vigor, not holding back any of his strength in an effort to injure his master. Said master was dodging the aggressive attacks without seemingly putting in any effort, but a frown was growing on his beautiful face. Marvolo's attacks were full of aggression and power, but lacked the refined grace of a true noble and the control to direct the power in question. In fact, his attacks seemed like they were poor imitations of Frankenstein's initial techniques. Rye's frown became more pronounced as the one-sided spar continued. The Noblesse noted that Frankenstein's techniques were far too incompatible with Marvolo's style, thus leading the Dark Wizard to form an awkward equivalent that functioned for him, but was very bad in terms of quality. True, any other opponent than Frankenstein and Rye himself would not last against even this vastly imperfect technique. But that didn't mean it was acceptable for the Noblesse to have a servant that lacked in terms of grace. Marvolo's attacks had begun to lack aggression as he began tiring, and the match was becoming boring. The former Dark Lord looked pitiful as he panted and heaved, and Rye looked quite unsatisfied with the performance of his newest servant. Still, Marvolo had yet to give up, and though Rye was thoroughly disappointed with nearly all aspects of the day's performance, he had to commend the wizard for not giving in to his body's demands of stopping. Finally, the sparring came to a halt as Marvolo seemed to have reached his limit. The man was panting heavily, sweat dripping from his handsome form, which was clearly knackered into the next century. Rye was suspended in the air, his elegant silhouette unruffled by the one-sided spar. Frankenstein had, in the meanwhile, been observing the spar from outside the room through a magic-infused glass with Draco and Narcissa. The expressions on the faces of the two humans were simply hilarious. Jaws touching the floor, the usually elegant Malfoys minus Frankenstein looked more like very large goldfishes than anything else. Draco, like every other student who had ever known Rye, knew that he was different, and his pure-blood father suddenly turning out to be a millennia-old scientist of the Muggle variety who was basically an indentured servant contracted to his classmate was a proof of this fact, but it had never truly sunken in as now. Watching Rye play with an incarnation of the Darkest Lord in the history of magic, kind like he was an aggravated puppy, proved that Draco knew nothing, even though he would have liked to believe himself in the know of matters surrounding Rye. After all, Draco considered himself one of Rye's close friends, despite the fact that half the school and everybody who had ever breathed in the terrifyingly beautiful boy's general direction considered themselves his close friend. However, Draco was different from those sycophants, mainly because he had been one of said sycophants, practically salivating at every opportunity they had a class together and bugging the living hell out of his yearmates for the better part of their first year. Surprisingly, it was a rather heated clash with the most unlikely person that sat him straight. It was, in fact, a Muggle-born wizard from Gryffindor of all people that finally got through his skull. Dean Thomas was everything Draco had been told to hate when his father had been, missing his memories. Draco could not say his father was insane then, as he was fairly sure regaining his memories had set more screws loose in his father's head, though he was decidedly more fun to be around now that he wasn't spouting pure-blood bigotry and the Malfoy code of conduct at every chance, and Draco had told him as much, gaining a snicker from the previous Dark Lord and a large smile from his father. It was largely because of his clash with Dean that he had even developed the guts to utter those words. It had been a sunny, bright day in April when Dean had confronted Draco. As usual, Draco had been covertly following Rai around the school when he bumped into the Muggle-born student, sending the poor boy tumbling to the ground wherein he, in turn, tumbled into Rai. Shocked silence had followed and Draco had panicked. "Watch where you're going, mudblood," he'd shouted, before running to an unamused Rai to check on him, not noticing how the other boy elegantly sidestepped him before he was hauling Dean up. Draco had been shocked. No one had ignored him, much less in favor of some unknown boy. "Why do you touch him?" The young Malfoy heir had shouted at Rai, who had looked wholly unperturbed. It wasn't Rai who'd answered.
"Because."
The Gryffindor had begun explaining as if he was describing the weather, as if he hadn't bumped into the most influential boy on the planet. "Because he knows better than you, Malfoy. He knows that blood means nothing if you're blessed enough to be born with magic. That blood is the same if you bleed, or if I bleed. Blood is a powerful tool of harnessing magic, yes, but my blood is no different than yours in that regard. Most of all, he touches me because we're friends, and unlike some people who seem to favor stalkerish tendencies," Draco flinched, "I bothered to actually talk to him instead of putting him on a pedestal." With that, both the Ravenclaw and Gryffindor boys left, leaving a guilt-ridden, angry, and shame-faced Slytherin in their wake. It had taken Draco 2 weeks to fully process his anger, during which he distanced himself from the buffoons that were his bodyguards, and truly thought about what Dean had said. Anger had gone then, and shame and guilt remained. The shame and guilt had ridden on Draco's mind for almost a month before he'd stood up with a determined glint in his silver eyes. It had been the end of the year feast, and Ravenclaw had utterly trounced the rest of the school, though no one really minded. Dumbledore had been twinkling merrily at the almost harmonical mood between the houses, occasionally frowning at the Slytherin table which, when not sneering at the rest of the school, was glowering at their food. Sick of his housemates, sick of his own attitude, sick of the guilt and shame he'd felt whenever he saw a Muggle-born, sick of fearing his father's reaction if he was to know Draco's thoughts, the Malfoy heir stood up suddenly, causing his cutlery to clang with his plate and Crabbe and Goyle to spray him with the foods in the mouths. The great hall fell silent, and everybody turned to look at the usually impeccable heir being drenched in various kinds of half-eaten bits of food. But Draco had been beyond caring. He ignored the disaster he was sure he looked like and marched to the Gryffindor table. "I'm sorry," he confessed to a perplexed Dean Thomas. "I'm sorry for being a bigot, and I'm sorry for being rude when it was my fault that you fell, and I'm sorry for calling you names." Draco continued, trying to ignore that the entire school was staring. "Merlin, how did Rai get anything done because the entire school stared at him constantly, and there were clubs dedicated to spotting him around the school?" Draco was feeling mightily uncomfortable under the weight of all the stares, and incredibly silly as well. "Right," the Slytherin said lamely, seeing as no one was reacting beyond the staring. Dean blinked. "I'll just go." As Draco turned around to leave, embarrassed but finally free of the shame and guilt that had been gnawing at him for the past month, he was stopped by someone grabbing his hand. He turned around and stared in surprise. It was Rai. It shouldn't be a surprise, really, seeing as Rai never limited himself to the Ravenclaw table, much to Snape's consternation. However, it wasn't Rai who spoke. "I." Dean seemed to be struggling and shared a look with Rai, who gave an encouraging smile to the Gryffindor. Dean looked back at Draco, with the same determination he'd felt. "I forgive you, my Draco." Though, Dean smiled slyly, and before lobbing a piece of pie at Draco's head, who stood in stunned silence. Dean grinned at the look on his face. "You might want to clean up." Silence reigned in the Great Hall.
"Food fight,"
shouted someone from the Hufflepuffs, and what followed was the single, most entertaining and biggest food fight ever. The teachers tried to stop them, but then Flitwick hit McGonagall in the face with chocolate cake, and they devolved into an impressive duel of transfiguration and charms that Draco would bet was historical. And if they hit Snape more than each other, no one mentioned it. Dumbledore's twinkle could probably be a Lumos Maxima at this point. And that was how he'd become one of Rai's closest friends. A smile tugged at the handsome young Malfoy heir's face as he reminisced about the incident, turning his attention back to the beatdown the former Dark Lord was suffering. Because even if Draco was impressed with the feats of magic Marvolo had been performing, one would be a complete moron to not notice that Rai batted each of those impressive feats away like they were flies. Draco had a smug look on his face as he thought about bragging about this to their friends. Hermione and Sue would be green with envy. Of course, Frankenstein's expression when he studied the spar was different, as he was furrowing his brow, disappointed in himself for not being able to train Marvolo to an acceptable level, disregarding the fact that it had been an impossible task given the time frame he'd been given. He was the single most intelligent mortal to have walked the planet in his previous life, and now that he had access to true magic, he should have been able to make a training facility that yielded better results. Noticing that the spar was done, he quickly took down the wards and walked into the sparring area, or rather, the remains of the training room. Marvolo was on his knees, panting as blood and sweat poured out from his body. Frankenstein's master was standing beside the poor wizard, looking absolutely impeccable as always. However, dread quickly filled Frankenstein. Master was frowning. Master, what is the matter? Is there something that bothers you? Is it Marvolo? Is it the room? What can dash? Rye broke Frankenstein's frantic train of questions with a raised hand. What has been bothering me, Frankenstein, is that you seem to have ignored something. His master's tone was severe. Frankenstein gulped. And what would that be? He hesitantly asked. Rye sighed. He knew his servant thought himself to be vastly more intelligent than the rest of the populace, which was true but also caused him to be incredibly arrogant. Rye held a hand out to Marvolo, who took it gratefully, throwing Frankenstein a half-hearted glare. The fighting style you have been teaching Marvolo is wholly unsuitable for him. You forget that M21, Tao and Takeo were modified, non-magical, humans whose styles could quickly adapt to yours, but Marvolo is a wizard. Rye emphasized the last word. Understanding dawned on the blonde scientist's face. Nevertheless, Rye continued, giving a rare smile to Marvolo, who smiled back hesitantly. Marvolo has shown amazing potential, seeing as he is able to hold me out of his mind during the battle, and his control of the magical aspect of his powers is admirable, though not perfect. His control over the powers he has been given to by me, however, is atrocious. Frankenstein winced as he heard the reprimand aimed at him. If I may ask, why can't you train me personally? Marvolo asked hesitantly. Rye and Frankenstein shared a look. Why don't the two of you get cleaned up, and we can continue this interesting debate in the living room over a cup of tea? Narcissa interjected before they could continue. They were all too happy to comply.